Well, we're going to pick up where we left off last time, but before we do, let me remind you that we're in the second section of the book, which is the pronouncement of judgments on 8 different nations. And the reason I continually remind you of this is because this needs to be ingrained within you. And I want to make sure that it is. Now, of these 8 different nations, 6 of the nations were pagan nations, or what we would call Gentile nations. The other 2 were Judah and Israel. Now, in chapter 2, verses 6 through 16, Amos pronounced judgment on Israel. And as you read it, you can clearly see that God was twice as tough on Israel than he was on the other nations. And I explained why last week. In fact, Amos actually deviated from the normal pattern of listing the one sin that caused the cup of God's wrath to overflow. You see, Amos began each pronouncement of judgment with the same Hebraism for 3 transgressions and for 4. And then he would list the 4th sin, which was the sin that caused the cup of God's wrath to overflow. But Amos didn't do that with Israel. Yes, he did use the same Hebraism, but he deviated from the normal pattern of listing the 4th sin, which again was the sin that caused the cup of God's wrath to overflow, and instead he listed 7 sins. With all of the other nations, he only listed 1 sin, but with Israel, he listed 7 sins. In other words, there wasn't just one major sin that caused the cup of God's wrath to overflow. There were 7 major sins. So let me give you the 7 sins that Israel was guilty of committing. I'll go through them quickly, and then we'll look at each one individually. Last week, we got through the first one, so we're actually going to get through, believe it or not, 2 through 7 tonight. So here they are. Number 1. They were lending money to the poor with the sole intent of taking possession of the mortgaged property through foreclosure. In other words, because they were not supposed to get interest when they loaned to a brother, in other words, to another Jew, what they were trying to do was to loan this money out, have them put up land or some type of property, and then they would hope that they would make some payments, but at the very end, they wouldn't be able to finish and pay off the loan. Therefore, they would not only get the money that they received, but they would also get the land that they'd put up as collateral. Number 2, they were walking all over the poor through unscrupulous business practices. We don't actually know what they were doing. We'll find that out as we look at this second sin, but we do know that they were really walking all over the poor. And they were doing it in such a way that was very, very calloused, and it really irritated God. Number 3, they were preying on the vulnerable and taking advantage of them sexually. And people, that always happens in a very wicked society. Those who are marginalized, those who really have no other recourse to come in and have any type of justification, it seems like the wicked prey on them, and they especially do it sexually. Number 4, when they foreclosed on the poor, they were taking every last thing they had, including the clothes on their back. You know, we say that sometimes. They even took the clothes off their back. But you know, they were actually doing that. Number 5, they were abusing their power and authority by levying unjust fines in order to support their own selfish pleasures. Number 6, they were ungrateful to God for the grace and mercy he showed towards them. And last but not least, they were coercing the Nazarites into breaking their vows, and they were silencing God's prophets. Now, as I've already said, we've already covered the very first sin, so now we're ready to look at the second sin, which is in verse 7. So look at verse 7. They trample on the heads of the poor as on the dust of the ground, and they deny justice to the oppressed. Now, I want you to underline that phrase, trample on the heads of the poor. People, that's a figure of speech. That's the equivalent of us saying to walk all over someone. You see, when you walk all over someone, what that means is that you have the power to make someone do what you want without any respect for their feelings. You don't care about what they think. You don't care about how they feel. This is what you're going to do, and there's really nothing they can do about it. So this is actually a metaphor of power for one group and utter humiliation for the other. The one who has the power can dictate the terms, and the other has to submit or face the consequences. There's really not anything they can do about it. Now, this is a horrible abuse of power, and it really angers God. And the reason it does is because God could do that to us if he so chose, but that's not the kind of God he is. And because he doesn't do it to us, he's setting an example. You know, we always talk about God as our Father, and we are the children of God. And just as in a physical family, the Father sets the example. He models how we're supposed to act. God does the very same thing for us. And God wants us to realize that if He wanted to, He could walk all over us. And there's really nothing that we could do about it, but He doesn't do that. And so it really irritates Him when we do it. In fact, many prophets talk about this, but I'm only going to use one example. Look with me in Isaiah chapter 3, verse number 15, and notice what it says. How dare you crush my people, grinding the faces of the poor into the dust, demands the Lord of heaven's armies. Now, they weren't literally grinding the faces of the poor into the dust. Again, it's a figure of speech, but what it means is there's not a thing they could do about it. They could just take advantage of them, do whatever they want. They could dictate the terms, and that was taking place. Now, Amos doesn't tell us specifically what they were doing to the poor, but it was clear to everyone that they were walking all over them. So that's the second sin they were guilty of. If you're taking notes, write this down. They were walking all over the poor through unscrupulous business practices. Now let's look at sin number 3, which is in the last part of verse number 7. Notice what it says. A man and his father go into the same girl to defile my holy name. Now what this is talking about is the sexual abuse of a female servant by the men in the family that she serves. And more specifically, a father and son. Now, the Torah actually provided protection for female servants because they were very vulnerable to mistreatment by their male masters. And this was something that could take place very easily if they didn't have the right protection. So the Torah specifically states certain things that protect female servants from being taken advantage of, and especially sexually. Look at Exodus chapter 21, verses 7 through 11, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. When a man sells his daughter as a servant, and you need to understand something, a man didn't do this lightly. When a man gets to this point, he's a broken man. He's literally having to sell his daughter as an indentured servant because he has a debt that he can't pay, and he's got a choice. Either he can sell off his land, and then his family has no way to make a living, or he can sell off some of his children, still work the land with the hope that he can buy her back. But a man's very broken when he has to do this. And so it says, when a man sells his daughter as a servant, she will not be freed at the end of 6 years as the men are. In other words, if she's sold into a place where the father can't buy her back. And you need to understand this is actually a protection because women really had no way of making a living. That's why you get this whole story with Ruth and Naomi. They come back and they're women, they're very vulnerable, they're the marginalized of society, and therefore they need a man. And if you don't really understand that, you don't understand the kinsman redeemer, the whole subject of the book. And so this was actually a protection. This kept a woman from being thrown out in the streets if she was bought into it. In other words, you had an obligation to keep her. So let's keep going. She will not be freed at the end of the 6 years as the men are. If she does not satisfy her owner, he must allow her to be bought back again. But he is not allowed to sell her to foreigners, since he is the one who broke the contract with her. But if the servant's owner arranges for her to marry his son, he may no longer treat her as a servant, but as a daughter. If a man who has married a servant wife takes another wife for himself, he must not neglect the rights of the first wife to food, clothing, and sexual intimacy. If he fails in any of these 3 obligations, she may leave as a free woman without making any payment, and there's other things that she gets as a result of that. But people, this makes it very clear that a woman who has been sold to a family as an indentured servant was not to be sexually abused in any way. And in order to have sex with her, you had to marry her. And she was to be treated as a wife, as a part of the family. If the son married her, she was to be treated as a daughter-in-law by the father. If the father married her, she was to be treated as a mother. It's very, very clear in the Torah. Not only that, but it was an abomination to God for a father and son to sleep with the same woman. Look at Leviticus chapter 20, verses 11 and 12. It says, if a man violates his father by having sex with one of his father's wives, both the man and the woman must be put to death, for they are guilty of a capital offense. If a man has sex with his daughter-in-law, both must be put to death. They have committed a perverse act and are guilty of a capital offense. Now, what was happening in Israel is that they weren't marrying the female servants in their home, but they were having sex with them. And they were justifying it by saying, well, neither one of us is married to her. So we're actually not breaking the Torah. But what they were doing was horrible. You see, the only reason women were sold into indentured servanthood was because they were in dire financial circumstances. It was done in order to survive or for the family to survive, or to pay off the debt of the family. But what was happening was these wealthy men were intimidating these women into having sex with them by using their financial situation against them. It was either be sent out in the code or sent back to their families, and then the family would have to pay their debt, which they couldn't do. That's why they were sold in the first place. Or have sex with them without them marrying them. And this became very common in Israel. That's how evil they were. What they were doing is they were preying on the most vulnerable and taking advantage of them sexually. Now, people, you need to understand something. We're doing that very same thing here in America. Women are forced into pornography and prostitution by men who are willing to take advantage of their vulnerability. They take advantage of those who are marginalized, taking advantage of those who are put in certain situations that they have no other place to turn. When you view pornography, you're involved in this sin. This is exactly what you're doing, and you need to realize that. Now, what else were they doing? Well, let's look at sin number 4, which is in the first part of verse number 8. Notice what it says. They lie down by every altar on clothes taken in pledge. Now, the phrase lie down is the key to understanding this particular sin that Israel was guilty of. First of all, they were lying down on the clothes that the poor had put up as collateral on a loan, which tells us which particular garment this is referring to. You see, in Amos' day, people wore a cloak that functioned as a coat during the day, but it also functioned as a blanket at night. And it's the only piece of garment that you could actually lie down on. But the law prohibited a person from taking it as collateral unless you returned it every night to the person who put it up as collateral. Look with me, if you would, in Exodus chapter 22, verse number 25. This explains it in quite detail. Notice what it says. If you lend money to any of my people who are in need, do not charge interest as a moneylender would. If you take your neighbor's cloak as security, in other words, as collateral for a loan, you must return it before sunset. Doesn't do you much good, does it? You take it for collateral in the morning, and then you have to find them at night and return it to them. This coat, talking about the cloak, may be the only blanket your neighbor has. How can a person sleep without it? If you do not return it and your neighbor cries out to me for help, then I will hear, for I'm merciful. So, you could take a person's cloak as collateral, but you had to return to them every night. And that would be such a hassle. So most people wouldn't even bother with taking a person's cloak as collateral. But in extreme cases, in extreme circumstances for the poor, didn't have anything else, they could put it up as collateral. And if they didn't want to beg for a handout, what they would do is they would offer their cloak as collateral. But they really didn't expect the person to take them up on it. How many have ever seen a person that's standing out there with a sign, and I'm not saying whether this is right or wrong, whether you should do this or you shouldn't do it. I'm using this as an example. They have a sign and they say, we'll work for food. Anyone ever seen that? And then you pull up to them and you say, well, I got some work to do. And they go, But I just want you to understand the certain thing. You know, they really don't expect you to say, well, jump on in, I'll take you home and you'll work. No, they don't expect that. And that was the Israelites at this time. They really didn't have anything to put up as collateral, but they were desperate for food. They were desperate for money. And so what they would do is they would ask someone to please not give them because they were too proud to beg. So they would say, please, loan me a few coins. I'll put my cloak up for collateral, not expecting that person to actually take it, because in the Torah it says if you take it as collateral, you have to return it at night, and that's too much of a hassle. So what they expected them to do was to say, don't worry about it, and give them a few coins. It was actually a handout. But people, the rich weren't doing that because they were so greedy. Instead of giving them a handout, which the Bible refers to as alms, and we should be giving alms, they would take, or they would loan them a few coins, and then they would take the cloak as collateral, knowing that they wouldn't be able to pay them back by that evening. So what they would say is, well, it's just a few coins. You take this, but if you want your cloak back, just come see me, pay me back tonight, you can have it back. They weren't supposed to do that, but they were doing it, literally taking everything that they had, including the clothes on their back. So the rich were literally taking every last thing that the poor had including the clothes on their back. But the sin goes even deeper if you read this closer. Look back at verse number 8. Notice where they were when they laid down on the cloak that they had taken from the poor. It says, they lie down by every altar on clothes taken in pledge. Now, under the Mosaic sacrificial system, you never laid down by the altar of God. There was no place to do that. If you've ever been to Jerusalem, or maybe you've even studied the temple and you know where it sat on the Temple Mount, and you look at all of the buildings that were there, what you'll find is there is no place for anyone to lie down by the altar. In fact, women never even got close to the altar. You remember they had the court of the Gentiles, and then the Gentiles couldn't go any further. If they went further than that, if they were uncircumcised, if they were a Gentile and went further than that, there were literally signs that said, if you do this, you will be put to death. And that was what Paul was accused of doing. They had seen him in town in Jerusalem with Gentiles. They knew he was preaching to Gentiles. Gentiles were being converted. So these Judaizers who didn't like Paul, they saw that, and then they accused him of bringing Gentiles past the court of the Gentiles. Now, after the court of the Gentiles, you went to the court of the women. Women, you could go that far. But you could not go where the men could go. You could only take that animal so far, your offering so far. The priest would have to meet it. He would have to take it further on. The men could go on, and they would go in and they would offer this offering, but there was never any place to ever lie down, and they wouldn't even allow you to do that. So what you would do is you would take your offering to the temple, the priest would offer it to God on the altar, and then you would take your portion of the offering home. But there was no place to lie down. But at the pagan temples, you had rooms specifically set up for temple prostitutes around the altar. So you brought an offering to the pagan temple, and then you went into one of those rooms to have sex with one of the temple prostitutes, because that was part of the type of worship that they had. They practiced something that was called imitation magic. And what imitation magic means is that you believe that there are such things as fertility gods. And if these fertility gods have sex in the heavens or wherever they are, then your soil, your ground, your land is going to be fruitful. Your wife is going to be fruitful. The more sex they have, the more fruitful your ground is, the more fruitful your crops are, the more fruitful your animals and your livestock are, the more fruitful your wife is. And so what they would do to try to stimulate these gods to have sex is that they would have sex. So you had these temple prostitutes, and they literally raised money for the temple by sleeping with these men. Now again, these were marginalized women. They were bought as slaves. They were raised up to be this, and that's what they would do. So you brought your offering to the pagan temple, then you went into one of these rooms to have sex with one of the temple prostitutes. And that's what this is referring to when it says that they laid down by the altar on the cloak that they took as collateral on the loan of a few coins. So sin number 4 was actually a combination of two things. Instead of giving the poor a few coins as alms, they were loaning it to them and literally taking every last thing that that person had, including their cloak, which was to keep them warm during the winter and also provide a blanket for them at night. They were taking as collateral. And to make matters worse, they were doing this on the way to pagan temples to sleep with their prostitutes. Now, why were they going to do this when they took these cloaks? Because that's where the poor would gather. How many of you remember the story about the crippled who was at the gates beautiful, and Peter comes up there and he's asking for alms, and Peter says, silver and gold have I none, but what I have I give unto thee. In the name of Jesus, get up and walk. And he grabs him and he pulls him up. Most of us don't think anything about it, but here's what you need to understand. If you wanted to be a successful beggar, if you wanted to make a lot of money, you had to be in the right place. Have you ever noticed when the homeless are out and they're begging for money on streets, sometimes they get into fights. Why do they get into fights? Because there are certain corners, there are certain streets that are more lucrative, and that's where you want to be. You make more money there. More people come by, maybe it's the right kind of people. Well, if you had to beg, where you wanted to beg was at the temple. Because even in the pagan religions, they were normally required to give alms, especially when you were going to worship the gods. And so this is where they were. They were at these pagan temples. And so they would come, and there's this syncretism here. They're mixing their religion with these pagan religions, but these beggars, these poor people are there because they're asking the rich, please do this. Take my cloak. Take my cloak as collateral. Just loan me some money. And they would go, all right, I'll take your cloak. And they'd give them a few money. They'd take that in. They didn't want to lay their clothes down. You're going to be sleeping with the prostitute. There's been a lot of men in there. So they would lay down that person's cloak, and then they would do this. So those were the two things that they were doing. And let me tell you, God was very, very upset. Not only were they taking advantage of the poor, but then they were coming in and taking their things and using it in a way that was an abomination to God, but also laying them down and using it in a way that they didn't even want to do their own clothes. And that's what he's talking about. Now let's look at sin number 5, which is mentioned in the last part of verse 8. And they drink wine bought with unjust fines. Now I want you to underline the word fines. If you don't understand that word, you don't understand what this is talking about. The word fines is translated from the Hebrew word onash. And it refers to a fine that a person pays for breaking the law, just like we would pay a fine for speeding. I don't know if you realize it. They moved the police station to a different place. And if you're going down this way towards the bypass and you go down that hill a little bit too fast, you just might get pulled over for speeding. If you get pulled over for speeding, you're going to have to pay a fine. Or maybe if you park where you shouldn't be parking, maybe it's in a fire zone and you're in front of a fire hydrant, well, you're going to have to pay a fine. You break the law, you pay a fine. Well, in Israel, you had judges just like we do today. And if you broke the law, we're not talking so much about the Torah. You had the Torah and you had laws, but you also had civil laws that were actually written in the Torah. And then, of course, the rabbis, they made these different laws that were part of the city. And if you broke these laws, or maybe you had a case against someone else, you had to come in front of the judges. And these judges normally met at the gates of the city. That's why when you read in the Old Testament, they're always talking about the men that sat at the gates of the city. Many of them were elected as judges just like we do today. And these judges would impose a fine, an onash. And the fines were supposed to go to one of two places. They were either supposed to go to the city coffers, just like it does today, or if maybe you had wronged someone, the fine that you were supposed to pay would go to the person that you had wronged. Now, these fines were supposed to be paid in coins or money, which went to the city coffers or to the person they had wronged. As an example, look at Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse number 19. This is just a good example. They must also fine him. That word fine is the Hebrew word onash. 100 pieces of silver. Now, why do I bring this up? Because they didn't want you bringing 3 lambs and 2 bushels of wheat and a cask of wine. No. You go sell that, you exchange it for money. We don't deal with that. When you have to pay a fine, you pay a fine with money. So he says, you must also fine him 100 pieces of silver, which he must pay to the woman's father, because he publicly accused the virgin of Israel with shameful conduct. So they literally put, this is what the fine is. And the Torah did that many times on certain things. But then the cities would also have these fines that are levied. But then there were also fines that was left up to the judge. So the fines were supposed to be paid in coins or money, which again went into either the city's coffers if you violated one of the laws of the city, but if you wronged someone, these fines were what you paid to the person you had wronged. But here's what the judges were doing. They were taking wine in lieu of them paying a monetary fine, which means that they were taking bribes. You see, you could either take them a bottle of wine and pay a small fine, or you could pay a huge fine. Now, when I say bottle of wine, you understand that I'm actually talking about the leather flask. I'm not saying like they had bottles of wine today. I'm just trying to get you to understand like you would do today. But what would happen is you would go to the judge and you would say, I know you've always been a fair person. You meet them at their house. I brought a little gift for you. Just want you to know I respect you. And that was kind of a wink, wink. I'm coming before you. And when I come before you, make sure that I don't have to pay too much. And so they were doing this, and I'll tell you, with the judge, you could become quite wealthy by doing this. You literally could have all of your pleasures met simply by saying, all right, I understand. I know you didn't mean to do that. You took that wine in there, and then when they came before you the next morning, you said, well, you are guilty, but you don't have to pay a stiff of a fine. And that's exactly what they were doing. This is what he was talking about. He talked about unjust fines. And when you look at that word unjust in the Hebrew, what it means is the fines did not fit the crime. And sometimes when we think about that, we have the tendency to think, well, that means that they had to pay more than what they were supposed to. But actually, the unjust means, no, if you paid off the right judges, you didn't have to pay as much. And so what took place is the poor couldn't do that. So if you wronged someone who was poor, and you know that, this is bad, I'm going to have to pay a lot. You went down to the judge and you said, we've been friends a long time. I just happened to be walking past your field and I realized your bull's not too good. I've got a bull that I'd like you to use. Don't worry about it. Next day, you go to the judges in front of the things. You're supposed to pay. Oh no, you don't have to pay as much. And the poor, they were taken advantage of because they didn't have the ability to do that. So the rich were taking care of the rich, and they were sticking it to the poor through these unjust fines. Now let's look at sin number 6, which is mentioned in verses 9 and 10. Yet it was I who destroyed the Amorite before them, whose height was like the height of the cedars, and he was as strong as the oaks. Yet I destroyed his fruit above and his root beneath. Also it was I who brought you up from the land of Egypt and led you 40 years to the wilderness to possess the land of the Amorite. Now I want you to notice that word Amorite. There are certain words that refers to groups of people that if you don't understand how it's used, you truly don't understand the story. You don't understand the Old Testament. I'll give you an example. Many times Israel, which was the northern kingdom, that's what that kingdom was called after the kingdom of Israel divided. Remember when Solomon died and his son came up and, they asked him to lighten the load and he said, well, let me talk to my advisors. His father's advisor said, you need to do that. If you do that, they'll love you. They'll serve you forever. The younger advisors, the ones that were his friends, said, don't do that. You tell them you're going to be even more strict than their father. And they said that, and of course, they split. And Jeroboam became the king of the northern tribes. So now you have two tribes. You have Israel. That's what they took their name as. And then you also had Judah, which is the two southern tribes. Now here's what's interesting. As you're reading through the Old Testament, you'll come across this word Ephraim. And you think, well, who is Ephraim? And you think, it must be just this one tribe. No, sometimes it refers to the tribe of Ephraim, but sometimes it refers to the whole kingdom of Israel. Why? Because Ephraim was the firstborn. And as the firstborn, his name became an eponym for the northern kingdom. So sometimes the northern kingdom is referred to as Israel. Sometimes it's referred to as Ephraim. You have to read it in context to tell. In fact, there's one prophecy that most people don't understand because it talks about in the last days, God will take Ephraim and Judah and take these two sticks and he will make them into one. And people go, what? What he's saying is he'll take those two kingdoms that were divided. When Jesus Christ comes back, all the Jews will no longer be two separate kingdoms. The 10 northern tribes were one kingdom. The two southern southern tribes were another kingdom. But what he's going to do is he's going to unite them, and they're just one kingdom called the nation of Israel. And that's what it means. Now, this word Amorite is the same way. Sometimes it means one thing. Sometimes it means another. You see, if the word Amorite is used in a narrow sense, it describes a specific ethnic group. But if it's used in a broad sense, it describes all of the inhabitants of Canaan prior to the children of Israel coming into the promised land. Look at Genesis chapter 15, verse number 16, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. This is the promise that God is making to Abraham. And he's telling Abraham, I'm going to bless your seed, and I'm going to turn your children, your seed, into a mighty nation. But I want you to understand something. They're going to go into Egypt. He told Abraham this before that ever happened. He said, your seed, your children are going to go into Egypt. And they're going to remain there for 400 years, and they're going to be slaves. And then I'm going to bring them out. But I want you to notice what he says. Let's read this. This is Genesis chapter 15, verse 16. He says, but in the fourth generation, And this is why we don't know what a generation is. Sometimes a generation is 100 years. So if a generation is 100 years and we know that this generation will not pass, and we start when Israel became a nation, we could go as far as 2048, take away the 7 years of the tribulation, and you're 2041. We start looking and say, well, we know somewhere between there Jesus is going to come back, depending upon whether you're a pre-tribulationist. If it's 80 years, sometimes it's 80 years. Sometimes it simply means that you go from the generation of the fathers passing away and the children coming. In this particular situation, we know because of the context, he speaks other places, that a generation is 100 years. So here's what he says. But in the fourth generation, they shall come hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. And so what this is saying is, the reason you're going to have to be in slavery in Egypt is because I have no land to give you, and the reason I don't is because I'm not going to kick these people out of the land. I'm not that kind of God. I'm not going to judge them and take it away from them until their sin is so full that they deserve to be judged, and they deserve judgment coming upon them. But here's what's interesting. When you read this and you don't understand it, it comes to the word Amorite, you think that it's talking about one specific ethnic nation. And it's a small little tribe here. And so all these other different ethnic tribes that are different than the Amorites, they deserve to be judged, but I'm holding out for this one. No, that's not what it means. This isn't talking about the specific ethnic group known as the Amorites. He's using this in a broad sense to refer to the Canaanites who lived in the promised land before the Israelites conquered them. So all of the different ethnic groups that were living in the area of Canaan were known as what? Amorites. It was used in a broad sense. Just like, what would we be? Telequaians? What would we be? Telequaites? Telequaonians, all right, or Telequaites or whatever. But we're also Oklahomans. We're also Americans. Do you understand what I'm saying? So you have to kind of know these names. So when you use the word Amorite, it can be used in a narrow sense and it refers to the specific ethnic group, or it can be used in a broad sense that refers to all of the people that were living in the land of Canaan. Now, of course, when Amos mentions the Amorites, he's using the term in the broad sense. And what he's saying is that you got to remember what God did for you, Israel. He brought you into the promised land. It was God who destroyed the Amorites. When you came to Kadesh Barnea and you sent spies in the land, they saw that it was a land of milk and honey, but they also saw that the Amorites were like giants. And that's why he talked about they were as tall as this tree, and their fruit was so huge. And it was like, we wanted what they had, but man, we were scared to death of them, the inhabitants of Canaan. And so, what he was saying was, I'm the God who led you through the wilderness to possess the land of the Amorites, also known as the Canaanites. And as a result of God doing that, you would have expected the Israelites to be grateful, and one of the signs of being grateful is what? To keep his commandments. If you love me, Jesus said, you will do what? You'll keep my commandments. The whole thing we've been talking about is called ethical monotheism. If you say you love God and you don't love your neighbor, then you're a liar. If you say you know the truth and that you love the truth, but you don't keep his commandments, you're a liar. And so they said they were grateful for God to do this, but they didn't keep his commandments. But his point is this. The reason you didn't keep his commandments is because you're not truly grateful to God for all that he's done for you. And people, that was their sixth sin. Let me tell you something. When you're not grateful to God for what he's done for you, it ticks God off. I've always said this. I'll do anything for my girls. You might be like this. When we go out to eat, it doesn't matter that my daughter is 31 and her husband is 31 and my other daughter's 28 years old. I get the check. I always pay for it. And I realize what's going to happen. It won't matter when Micah finally finishes her residency and my son-in-law does, and they're both doctors and making great money, and Macy gets married and doing that. I can guarantee you I'll be 70 years old and we're going to go out to dinner. Who's going to get the check? It's going to be me. And I love blessing my kids. I really do. I love blessing them with gifts. If they need anything, I tell them this. You're the reason I work. You need money, you come to me. Often, they don't know this, but I would deny myself to take care of them. But let me tell you what would tick me off. What would tick me off is to give to my girls and they're not grateful for it. The reason I don't mind giving to my girls is because they're very grateful. God is like that. Many times God's not blessing you, and I'll tell you why He's not blessing you. He's not blessing you because you're not grateful for what He's given you. You're all complaining about what you have. I'm going to tell you why you didn't get what you wanted. Because you're not grateful for what you have right now. One time I was mad at God. I'd gone in the ministry, I'd given up businesses, and I was on the fast track to making some money. And to go into the ministry, we had reverted back, and I was poor, and my girls were very little, but I still couldn't do things for them that I wanted to do. And I was mad at God. And God spoke to me very harshly. He said, if you can't appreciate what I'm doing for you now, then I can't bless you with anything else. That's an attitude adjustment. So we get to this sixth sin, and God tells them, you're not keeping my commandments because you're not grateful to me. And there's one thing I can't stand, it's an ungrateful bunch of children. Now, let's look at the seventh sin, which is mentioned in verses 11 and 12. I raised up some of your sons as prophets. Your children, I raised up some of them as prophets. And some of your young men as Nazirites. Is it not so, O you children of Israel, says the Lord? But you gave the Nazirites wine to drink. And you commanded the prophets, saying, don't prophesy. Shut up. Now, most of you probably are not familiar with Nazirites. Nazirites were men who dedicated themselves to God and who lived a consecrated, holy life. Now, some of the Nazirites were Nazirites for life. How many of you can think of a couple of examples of Nazirites for life? Anyone? Old Testament. First one should come to your mind is Samuel. Yeah, who said Samuel? Yeah, Samuel was one. You remember, dedicated to the Lord. She couldn't have children. And so, well, I'll dedicate my firstborn. God opens up the womb. She waits until he's about 5 years old. He's completely weaned. She takes him to him. Heartbreaking, but she gives him to God. And he's a Nazirite from then on. What's another one that really didn't turn out very good? We know him as one of the judges. We think he's very, very strong. Samson. The strength was in his what? Why was the strength in his hair? Because he was a Nazirite. We'll find that out in just a second. Now, did the New Testament have any Nazirites? Oh, come on, people. Who prepared the way for Jesus? John the Baptist. Long flowing hair, camel skin around him, eating wild locusts in the wilderness. This guy's a Nazirite. It's written all over him. Lived with the Essenes. This guy's a Nazirite. Now, some of them were Nazirites for life. Samuel was a Nazirite for life. It was a vow he took, and from the time he was 5 years old, he was a Nazirite to the day he died. Samuel, even though he didn't do what he should have done, and he revealed that, his hair was cut, lost his power, and then his hair began to grow back. He rededicated his life to God, and he destroyed the Philistine. Pushed it over. John the Baptist. But then you had Nazirites that were Nazirites just for a specific period of time. In fact, Paul takes that vow, if you remember. They begin when they take the vow as a Nazirite, and they cut their hair, they shave their hair. And then from that point on, they're not going to, and it's for a specific point. They've got this vow, I'm not going to drink anything of the vine, but let me just kind of show you what it is. Turn to Numbers chapter 6, verses 2 through 8, and you'll kind of understand what a Nazirite is. Give the following instructions to the people of Israel. If any of the people, either men or women could do it too, take the special vow of a Nazirite, setting themselves apart to the Lord in a special way. You are consecrating yourself to a holy life to God. They must give up wine and other alcoholic drinks. They must not use vinegar made from wine or from other alcoholic drinks. They must not drink fresh grape juice. And they must not eat grapes or raisins, anything from the vine, as long as they are bound by their Nazirite vow, because you take a vow, if you're not one for life, for a specific amount of time. How many of you have ever fasted for a period of time? 3 days, 7 days, 10 days, 12 days. Anyone ever done that? You're not going to eat for a specific period of time. Well, these would take a Nazirite vow, but it wasn't for days, it was for months, maybe years. They are not allowed to eat or drink anything that comes from a grapevine, not even the grape seeds or skins. They must never cut their hair throughout the time of their vow. There's why Samson got in trouble. She should have known. This tells you that he was with the woman he shouldn't have been. He was unequally yoked. Anyone who was an Israelite knew why Samson was strong. She was a wicked Philistine. He had no business being with her. Every woman who was an Israelite knew his strength was in his hair. Why? Well, they never cut their hair throughout the time of their vow, for they are holy. Look at this. They are holy and set apart to the Lord. Until the time of their vow has been fulfilled, they must let their hair grow long, and you don't ever cut it. And they must not go near a dead body during the entire period of their vow to the Lord. Even if the dead person is their own father, mother, brother, or sister, they must not defile themselves, for the hair on their head is the symbol of their separation to God. This requirement applies as long as they are set apart to the Lord. Yeah. Now, there were two reasons why a person would take the vow of a Nazirite. The first one was for personal reasons. And for most, it was to show their gratitude to God. In other words, they were so thankful for God's grace that they purposely changed their lifestyle to show their gratitude. And during the time of their vow, they purposely sought to grow closer to God. It was one of these things that I love you, God. I want to grow closer to you. And just like we fast and pray, or we set aside a time to do this, they would say for the next 3 months or the next 6 months or for the next year, I'm taking this vow. I'm not going to eat any of these things. When normally everyone's doing this, I separate myself. I'm in the Word. I'm in prayer. The second reason was to publicly confess their dedication or commitment to Yahweh. And by doing that, they became an example of holiness to others. And their lifestyle during that time was a reminder to the people to be holy, even as God is holy. So these Nazirites were easy to see, and that's why God didn't want them to cut their hair. Men did not wear long hair like we think they did back then. They would cut it off. It usually would get to the shoulders, and they would cut it off. It was a shame, as Paul said, for a man to have long hair, where it was the glory of the woman. And so men didn't have long hair like we think. So Jesus down to hair down here. No, you didn't do that. But when you saw a man, and he had hair, it was down to here, and that would have been John the Baptist, or down to his rear. And you could just tell he lived this holy, ascetic life. And it was a reminder that we have people who are dedicating their life to God. They are praying for our nation. They are seeking God. They're exhorting people. They're keeping the law, and they're exhorting other people to keep the law. So that's the second reason they would do that. Now let's talk about prophets, because not only did they do this to the prophets, but they also, to the Nazirites, they also tried to silence the prophets. So let's talk about prophets before we look at specifically what they did to the Nazirites and then to the prophets. Prophets were the mouthpieces of God. And if you've been coming for a while, you know what happened when an Old Testament prophet prophesied. What happened to an Old Testament prophet when he prophesied? Well, the Holy Spirit would come upon him. Remember? He would go into an open-eyed trance, and everything that came out of his mouth was the Word of God. It was almost as if he was a puppet. We've gone through that. And so these prophets in the Old Testament were mouthpieces of God. God would send them, they would prophesy. Everything that came out of their mouth had to come to pass. If one thing didn't come to pass, they were not a true prophet of God. Why? That meant that the Holy Spirit didn't come upon them. They went into an open-eyed trance, and God didn't have control of their tongue. Because anytime God takes control of their tongue, everything that comes out of the mouth, it'll happen. Now, the Israelites wanted to shut down every channel of divine communication. At least all communication that came from Yahweh. The false gods, I hate to say this, but all of these false gods, they're gods of pleasure. and you like serving them. In order to worship them, you have sex. In order to worship them, you do these things. But not Yahweh. Yahweh expects you to be holy. Yahweh expects you to be righteous. And so they wanted to shut down every channel of divine communication that was coming from Yahweh. So they coerced the Nazarites into drinking wine, which violated their vow. It was funny to them to slip them wine or to say, you just ate that and it had grapes in it. You didn't realize that, did you? You broke your vow. They were purposely doing this. Why? Because they were making fun of Christians, much like what America does today. Let's continue on. And they did everything they could to try and muzzle God's prophets. Now, people, when you read through the Old Testament, you have to understand when Amos was prophesying, and he was prophesying during this divided monarchy time. So when you're reading through the Old Testament that deals with this time period, you see several examples of this. I'm going to go through this real quickly. They'll come up on the screen, but let me just give you some examples. If you remember, Jezebel tried to muzzle Elijah and the other prophets of God. When did Elijah minister? He ministered during the divided monarchy period, shortly before Amos came along. And Jezebel tried to muzzle him. Look at 1 Kings chapter 18, verses 1 through 4. It says, later in the 3rd year of the drought, the Lord said to Elijah, go and present yourself to King Ahab. Tell him that I will soon send rain. So Elijah went to appear before Ahab. Meanwhile, the famine had become very severe in Samaria. So Ahab summoned Obadiah, who was in charge of the palace. Obadiah was a devoted follower of the Lord. Once when Jezebel had tried to kill all of the Lord's, notice that's all caps, Yahweh's prophets, Obadiah had hidden 100 of them in 2 caves. He put 50 prophets in each cave and supplied them with food and water. Ahab, Jezebel's husband, King Ahab, he muzzled Micaiah. Look at 1 Kings chapter 22, verses 25 through 27. I'm not going to read it. You can go back and read it. Joram attempted to kill Elijah. How many of you remember he was going to cut his head off? And Elijah knows what's happening because he's a prophet of God. Murderers come to the front door, tells the servant, don't let him in the door until God intervenes. That's 2 Kings chapter 6, verse 31. Go back and read it. And of course, Amaziah tried to muzzle Amos. In fact, when you get to Amos chapter 7, verses 12 through 13, you'll see that. Let's read that, if you don't mind. We have time to do that. Then Amaziah sent orders to Amos, get out of here, you prophet. Go on back to the land of Judah and earn your living by prophesying there. Don't bother us with your prophecies here in Bethel. This is the king's sanctuary. It's not God's. This is the king's sanctuary. It's not God's. And the national place of worship. Oh, man, they had missed it. They didn't want to hear from God. You know, America's becoming like that. When we speak out and we say this is a sin, people don't want to hear that. And what do they say? That's hate speech. No, it's not. It's love speech. Because if I don't tell you that you won't get to heaven if you're going to continue to practice those things, if I don't tell you that you're a sinner and you need Jesus and you die, you're going to stand before God one day and be thrown into the lake of fire. And did I really love you? No. But you see, when you're doing things, you don't want anyone to tell you you're doing anything wrong. So that was their 7th sin. They were coercing the Nazarites into breaking their vows, and they were silencing God's prophets because they didn't want anyone from God telling them that they weren't living right, that what they were doing was sinful. They didn't want anyone coming and saying, you're breaking God's law. And if you break God's law, you're going to be punished. Maybe not in this life, but in the life to come. And the only way to get away from this, and we know, is Jesus Christ. So let me list all of the sins they were guilty of. I'll leave this up here so you can take notes when we finish. Here they are. Number 1, they were lending money to the poor with the sole intent of taking possession of the mortgaged property through foreclosure. Number 2, they were walking all over the poor through unscrupulous business practices. Number 3, they were preying on the vulnerable and taking advantage of them sexually. Number 4, when they foreclosed on the poor, they were taking every last thing they had, including the clothes on their back. Number 5, they were abusing their power and authority by levying unjust fines in order to support their own selfish pleasures. Number 6, they were ungrateful to God for the grace and mercy He had showed towards them. And number 7, they were coercing the Nazarites into breaking their vows, and they were silencing God's prophets. Now, people, these 7 sins had caused the cup of God's wrath to overflow, and now judgment couldn't be stopped. And this is the judgment that would come upon them. Their army would be completely destroyed, and they would be carried into captivity. Look at verses 13 through 16, and we're closing with this. Behold, I am weighed down by you as a cart full of sheaves is weighed down. You know what God said? You burdened me so much, I can't even get up. That's how burdened you've made me. Therefore, flight shall perish from the swift. The strong shall not strengthen his power, nor shall the mighty deliver himself. He shall not stand who handles the bow, the swift of foot shall not escape, nor shall he who rides a horse deliver himself. The most courageous men of might shall flee naked in that day, says the Lord. Now, you don't get what this is saying because, our military is not like this. If it was saying it in today's terms, it would say, the Marines won't be the first to enter and the last to leave. They'll all be destroyed. The Navy, the ships will sink in the sea. The Air Force, they'll refuse to fly, and those that fly will be shot down. The rest of them will be destroyed on the airstrips. And they would go through every bit. The army, the infantry will be afraid to march into battle, and when they decide to retreat, they will be cut off. This is what he's saying. The swift can't get away. The strong loses his power. Even the person on the horse can't get away. So what he was actually saying is, no one will escape. And that's exactly what happened in 722 BC. They were conquered by the Assyrians, and they were carried into captivity. And the army that they had put their faith in was completely destroyed. And then what we know as the northern kingdom will not be reestablished until the millennium. Are there people that know their heritage even now? Yes. You have those who know that they're from the tribe of Simeon, they're from the tribe of Reuben, they're from the tribe of Gad, they're from the tribe of Manasseh, they're from the tribe of Naphtali, they're from the tribe of Asher. They know that. Zebulun. They know they're from those tribes. Issachar. You can go to Israel. They'll tell you what tribe they're from. They've kept that all these years. But one day, God's going to put it together, and they're all back. One nation. And that's what he's talking about. Now, here's what we're going to do. They didn't treat the poor right. So how do you treat the poor, or how do you help the poor without hurting them? That's what we need to teach on, and I'm not going to do it on a Wednesday night. We're going to move on next week. But on a Sunday morning, I'm actually going to do a series on how to help the poor without hurting them. Because let me tell you something, people. We have a responsibility to help the poor. That's part of the gospel of Jesus Christ. When John the Baptist wasn't sure if Jesus was the one. Why? Because John the Baptist was a Nazarite. He lived a holy ascetic life, and Jesus comes along, and he's turning water into wine, and, they're saying he's a wine bibber, and he's partying with sinners. And he sends his people and says, are you the Messiah, or should we look for someone else? And Jesus says, you go back and tell him this. And the very first thing he says, the gospel is being preached to the poor. The gospel has certain qualities about it that can break the bondages of poverty. But the church doesn't teach it, and the church doesn't practice it, and therefore we're not doing what we're supposed to.